we are gonna get started here. Good morning and a very pleasant Monday, everyone. I think according to a large rodent in Pennsylvania, it's gonna be spring any minute. So we have that to look forward to. I am Horacio Mendez. I'm the president and chief executive officer of the Woodstock Institute. I'm just Pardon, I'm scanning through a lot of names that are popping up. And while many of you who have registered, we know many of you, there are a few names and organizations that are new to us, and that's great. We're thrilled you could join us this morning. But because of that, and for those of you who aren't as familiar with our work, we are a 52-year-old research and advocacy organization focused on discrimination and predatory practices within the financial system. Our starting point as a partner with National People's Action in the 70s led to an important role with the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act in 1975, followed shortly afterwards by the Community Reinvestment Act a couple years later, and then leveraging the power that the Community Reinvestment Act, or CRA, gave community by negotiating the first major reinvestment agreement with a bank in 1983. As you can see, we focus on issues like mortgage lending, small business lending, community reinvestment, and community financial protection, including high-cost lending, which is why we are here today. So a little bit of context. I mentioned our role in drafting the passage of the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, or HMDA, and the CRA, because we've played that role for over 5 decades. Most recently in 2021, we saw the passage of the Illinois Community Reinvestment Act, which expanded CRA obligations to credit unions and mortgage companies chartered by the state of Illinois. We also celebrated a big win with the Illinois Predatory Loan Prevention Act, which we refer to as the PLPA, which built off of the protections in the Federal Military Lending Act that protects active service members of our military from predatory lenders by capping interest rates on consumer loans at a 36% all-in annual percentage rate, or APR. We took those protections and gave them to everyone in Illinois. And the law passed both houses with large bipartisan majorities after research we conducted from data released by the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation, showing that at least $500 million was being drained every year from the pockets of Illinoisans in excess fees and interest when compared to the protections that was afforded by this rate cap. So we're honored that a few folks who were part of that majority and some other distinguished guests have joined us this morning. For the elected officials present who would like to be recognized, now is a good time to turn on your camera and give us a wave. We have with us the office, if not the senator herself, Maddie Hunter, State Representative Camille Lilly, State Representative Sonia Harper, also a good partner of ours in a lot of different areas, State Representative Brandon Schweizer, former state senator, I think she's here, current member of the Illinois Human Rights Commission, and technically my boss, she's on our board here at the Woodstock Institute, Jacqueline Collins. I believe I saw the director of the Division of Financial Institutions, Francisco Menchaca, and the acting director of the Division of Banking, Susana Soriano. Thank you all for joining us. It's wonderful to have you here, and this is important information to share, as you'll see in a few minutes. Before the passage of the PLPA, the average interest rates were 178% for auto title loans and 297% for payday loans. It goes without saying that these loans were originated primarily in Black and Brown communities, but we also saw large concentrations of originations in white communities scattered throughout the middle and southern portions of our state. So this isn't just about Black or brown, or politically, this isn't about red or blue. It's about green. As I say often and occasionally at the disapproval of my staff, Woodstock Institute is about finding out who's getting screwed, who's doing the screwing, and what we can do to stop it. And in the case of consumer loans in our state, there were way too many people getting screwed. And because of the work we did with our coalition of nonprofits and elected officials and agencies, in the year after the PLPA was passed, we found that consumers had saved over $600 million in loans, in loan fees and interest. That's 600 million. So what we're going to be discussing today is actually the second poll we've done on this issue. In 2022, we hired Lake Research Partners and David, who's with us today, and you'll hear from in a minute. And we found that support was overwhelming among voters across both demographics and party affiliation. Despite the overwhelming support, we keep having to defend the PLPA from high-cost lenders trying to carve out exceptions for themselves that would allow them to charge triple-digit interest rates on their loans again. Unfortunately, and to the cost and detriment of consumers, the pawn loan industry in Illinois succeeded at this. And their rate cap on most loans is now somewhere in the neighborhood of 240%. And these attacks just keep coming. They must be counting on nonprofits running out of money to repeatedly fight their well-financed lobbyists and political influence. The high-cost lenders have been circulating a proposal that would allow them to charge consumers more in a lot of different ways. And today's poll is going to be a critical tool for debunking some of their talking points and push back against some of these repeated efforts to weaken what we feel is a really important poverty alleviation tool. So today's poll covers how likely voters feel about the rate cap, the 36% rate cap. Once again, we found support was extremely high across the board, including by demographic groups, party affiliation, and income levels. In fact, we found that an overwhelming majority thought 36% APR was too high and that the rate cap should be even lower. Even more interestingly, we specifically zeroed in on how former high-cost loan recipients have fared under the new law. High-cost lenders often argue that a 36% rate cap leaves lower-income communities worse off because they rely on loans with a 297% interest rate. We found that wasn't the case at all. Former loan recipients were both more supportive of the law than the general population was, and were largely still able to access credit. They were also more likely to support a rate cap lower than 36%. This directly contradicts a poll put out by the Online Lenders Alliance, claiming that nearly 3/4 of their borrowers were no longer able to borrow money they needed. During the presentation, we're going to get into why that poll should hardly be considered valid research and is, at best, misleading. So everyone, I'm going to stop talking here. It's something that's not easy for me to do. I love to talk about this stuff. But I'd like to introduce you to David Mermin from Lake Research Partners. They're a leading national public opinion and political strategy firm who conducted both the poll we're going to discuss today and our 2022 poll on the PLPA that I referenced earlier. Now, David's been in this business for over 20 years. He must have started when he was very young, and has advised a very long list of political candidates, advocacy organizations, foundations, and labor unions, many of which I'm sure you've heard of. So I'll let him take it from here, but we are very lucky to work with him and are incredibly appreciative of the funders that gave us the resources we needed to hire the very best in the industry. So David, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Horacio, and it's an honor to be doing this work and to share it with all of you. And as noted, I'm a partner at Lake Research Partners, a national public opinion research firm. And some of you may know Linda Lake, my partner who heads the firm in Washington, D.C. I'm based on the West Coast and work with my team. Emily Gardner, who's a senior analyst, did a lot of the heavy lifting on this research, and we're excited to share it with you. As Horacio noted, we wanted to look at two things in particular, and I will put these slides on the screen in just a minute. We were interested in what the voters of Illinois broadly thought of the policy of capping the interest rate at 36%, and the passage of the act that capped those rates, and whether they supported continuing to have a cap on interest on loans in Illinois. And we also did an additional sample above and beyond the sample of likely voters of people who had themselves taken out high interest loans in the past, the kinds of predatory loans that lenders were able to offer before the passage of the act. And with that additional sample, we're able to tell a lot about the attitudes of that particular group in the population, including their experiences with those previous high interest loans, their experience in accessing credit since the cap has been in place, and their attitudes toward having a cap on interest rates in lending in Illinois. And all of those findings, as Horacio indicated, are very clear in terms of what the beliefs of Illinois voters, as well as low-income Illinoisans, largely low-income, who have been taking those high-interest loans. So I'm going to put on screen now the presentation of the findings. I am going to go through these in order and share what we've learned. And then at the end, of course, we'll be happy to take questions and discussion of this. So as noted, this survey was of 500 likely voters. That's our main sample. And then we did this additional oversample of 200 high interest loan recipients. And because we had some high interest loan recipients in the likely voter sample as well, we have well over 300 loan recipients in the sample as well. So these are both valid samples representative of the entire state in terms of who those populations are. And going from there, I will lay out just in bullet form some of the overview of the findings, and then we'll show you graphically some of the actual data and numbers. So this was fielded last year. We had these two samples, likely voters and additional adults who report having taken out a payday or auto title loan since 2019. It was stratified by gender, age, race, and region to reflect the demographic composition of these populations in Illinois. Margin of error on these numbers, plus or minus 4.4% for the likely voter sample and 5.9% for the high interest loan sample. And demographically, this is likely voters. It's representative of the entire state. Obviously, in terms of partisanship, in terms of race, income, age, et cetera, reflective of the population of voters. And then this additional sample, combined sample of those who have received high interest loans in the past, also representative of the entire state, but obviously this is a somewhat different demographic population. It's relatively lower income, lower education levels, more diverse, higher proportions of Black and Latino Illinoisans, although about half of them are white. So that's just to note that those differences in the two samples that overlap here in the data. So overall findings are these. First, looking at those who actually had received high interest loans in the past. We asked about their experiences with those earlier loans, those very high interest loans that existed in Illinois before the rate cap was in place. We asked, what was the impact on you and your family from having those high interest loans and having to pay them off? 2/3 of those Illinoisans who had taken out those loans reported negative financial impacts from paying off those loans. And a wide range of negative impacts, having to cut back on necessities such as food, medical care, and prescription drugs, being unable to pay rent, mortgage, or other bills on time, incurring overdraft fees, and having to take money out of long-term savings. We've also asked, what has your experience been since the implementation of the cap in 2021? And most of these high interest loan users have found ways to continue to access credit in the absence of these predatory loans. Now, not all of them have attempted to access loans or other credit since the rate into effect, but those who have, vast majority said they were able to access the credit that they needed and obtain the cash that they needed through those other sources of credit. Since that time, the majority were able to get it. And this is the finding that, as Horacio pointed out, contradicts a finding that was released by the Online Lenders Association, somewhat interested party, who apparently were surveying their own customers, a selected sample of their own customers, and claiming that that was representative of all high interest loan recipients in Illinois. But it appears that's not the case, and we show the very clear finding in contradiction to what they were claiming about those loan recipients. We also asked more broadly of the voters in Illinois how they feel about the legislation, the Predatory Loan Prevention Act, that places a 36% rate cap on consumer loans. And the overall conclusion, it's really overwhelming in the data that their voters are very supportive of this rate cap, cross demographics and party affiliation. There's really no group that we find that's significant in the data that is actually opposed to this. Notably, those who were themselves high interest loan recipients are more supportive of the rate cap than even more supportive than other voters. And very clear finding, we asked, well, what about this number 36%? Do you think it's too high, too low, or about right? An overwhelming majority of voters say that that rate cap of 36% is actually too high. 8 in 10 voters say, well, if it were up to me, we should have a lower rate cap in Illinois, lower than 36%. And this finding is really quite consistent across demographics and party affiliation. So you'll see in the data, the numbers of support and opposed for the rate cap. There are a minority of voters who actually oppose it, but we found that most of those who opposed initially said they opposed the rate cap did so because they thought it was too high, that it should be lower than it is, not because it was too low. So that leads to the general conclusion that you've got an overwhelming majority in favor of actually lower, certainly having a cap, and if anything, a lower rate than exists now. And it's particularly true that when voters hear what the average interest rates were for payday and auto title loans in Illinois before the rate cap was passed, support for that rate cap jumps by double-digit margins to a very strong majority, strongly in support. And then we asked about one other policy, which is whether there should be a rule that would require small business lenders to disclose the APR of their loans, and 8 in 10 voters support that rule as well. So that's also very strong support for that disclosure. So turning first to this experiences with lending, now I'm going to show you some of the numbers behind those findings that we were just summarizing there. First of all, we asked, again, asking within the group of people who said, yes, at some point prior to 2021, after I had taken out a high interest loan higher than 36%. What were the impact of having that type of high interest loan? What were the impacts on your family? The number one most common impact, and we had a wide range of possible things that might have happened, and we asked people to pick which of these had the biggest impact on their family. And the ones that they said they were most likely to have as an impact in their life was having to cut back on necessities, such as food, medical care, prescription drugs. 31% have had to change their access to things like food and medical care as a result of the payments they were making on those high interest loans. 31% reported that. 17% reported being unable to pay rent, mortgage, or other bills. Obviously, that could contribute to a housing crisis and people not being able to access housing or potential homelessness. 16% incurred additional overdraft fees. 12% had to take money out of a savings plan, a 401k or other savings plan. 11% had to take on additional debt. 11% had utilities such as electric or Wi-Fi cut off. 10% had been contacted by a debt collector. So really a wide range of negative impacts, adding up to a large majority who had at least some negative impact on their family and on their own finances as a result of having to pay those high interest loans. On the flip side, we asked now, since the law was passed in 2021, capping interest rates, have you been unable to borrow money from a lender when you needed it? And we deliberately, the question is phrased in a negative way, have you been unable to borrow? And we did that deliberately to reflect the exact wording of the question that the Online Lenders Association had released in their survey the previous year. And they claimed, well, their press release claimed that nearly 3/4 of high interest loan recipients couldn't get loans. The actual number they reported was 56%, which is not 3/4, but it did say that a majority couldn't get loans. So we asked the same question of what we believe to be a much more accurate sample, a much more complete sample of high interest loan recipients across the state. And we found, to the contrary, that of those who reported needing extra cash, now not all of them had said that they had needed to borrow since that time, but those who said, I needed to borrow extra cash, I needed to find some kind of loan since that time, a majority said I was able to get a loan, and only 38% weren't sure, couldn't remember. 37% were unable to get a loan. So it is a clear majority said they were able to get a loan, in direct contradiction to the data that was reported by the OLA themselves. So clearly there's something misleading in the data that they provided there, and this is a much more accurate reflection. So again, this group had negative impacts of their earlier high interest loans, most of them since the cap on loans have been able to obtain with this specific phrasing of the question that we borrowed directly from their survey. Then when we asked in a more positive way, when you were attempting to take out a loan since 2021, since the rate cap went into effect, were you able to borrow money that you needed, right? So this is a much more direct and straightforward way of asking the question. 81% said, yes, I was able to borrow money when I needed it since 2021. So large proportion said they were able to borrow the entire amount they needed. Additional proportion said they were able to borrow some. Those two added together is 81%. Only 16% said I was not able to borrow the money I needed. So it is quite a small minority of these previous high interest loan recipients who said they couldn't borrow since that time. We also asked specifically, were you able to obtain a credit line increase if they needed to access credit since that time? 2/3 of those who had applied for credit in this period were able to receive it, 65%, and about 1/3, 34% said they were not. So then we turn to the question of policy. So one clear finding, high interest loan recipients had some negative impacts from their earlier high interest loans. Since they've had the cap, most have been able to obtain credit. Now we turn to the question of what should the law be in Illinois? What should the rules be in terms of the interest rates that can be charged? This is now among all likely voters. Those previous findings were among the high interest loan recipients only. This is now looking at everyone who is a likely voter in Illinois statewide. And we asked a simple question. Do you think that companies should be able to charge interest rates higher than 36%? Should they have a cap of 36%, or should there be a cap that is lower than 36%? Given those three choices, there's really only one answer that is agreed to by the overwhelming majority of voters in Illinois, which is that the cap should actually be lower than 36%. 80% of Illinois voters believe that. You see in the table on the right side here, every demographic group between 75 and 86% agree with this, say that the cap should be lower. Only 8% of voters think the cap should be right at 36%, and only 4%, 1 out of 25 Illinois voters think, oh no, we should go back to having higher interest rates. They should be allowed to go higher than 36%. That is the actual constituency for a higher interest rate availability of higher interest loans in Illinois. 4% of the people in Illinois. 88% think we should have a cap of 36% or lower, and most of those would like it to be lower. Notably, that was likely voters. Side by side here, you see our additional sample of those high interest loan recipients, the people who themselves were the customers of those earlier predatory loans with high interest rates, the ones for whom supposedly the argument has been made, oh, they need access to this type of loan. What do they think the interest rate cap should be in Illinois? Well, 88% of them think there should be a cap and it should be lower than 36%. 7% think it should be, 7% of them think that the cap should be 36%. And 3% of the loan recipients themselves say, oh, we should have rates higher than 36%. I want to go back to that. So really, there's essentially nobody in the state who, once they hear what the options are in terms of whether there could be rate caps or not, would like to see a higher rate cap. That support for that simply doesn't exist. Now, we did ask separately among the likely voters, do you support the actual law? When we told them there was a law that took effect in 2021, it provides an interest rate of cap of 36% on payday, auto title, and other loans. Do you support or oppose it? Before we told them anything else about interest rates, we had a clear majority who said, yes, I support that cap. 58% are in favor of it, 25% opposed. That's a pretty strong finding. It's well over 2-to-1. It's a clear majority across the board that say, yes, we should have that interest rate cap. Then we gave them one more piece of information. And remember, some of those who oppose it, we know from the other question, they oppose it because they think that 36% rate is too high, right? So that's really where the opposition comes from. It's not because they think it should be removed or that there should be even higher interest rates, just the opposite. They think it should be lower. But we did tell people after that initial question, before the 36% interest rate cap was passed, the average interest rate in Illinois for auto title loans and payday loans was 178% and 297%. Knowing this, do you support or oppose this cap? And then immediately that support jumps up. Oh, I did, once they realize, and with this basic piece of information, that there were very, very high interest rates being charged previously, immediately support jumps up to 71%. And you now have well over 2/3, almost 3/4 of Illinois voters saying, yes, we should keep that 36% cap, and only 17% who say, no, I'm still against that. And remember, those who are against it, most of those actually think the rate should be lower, not higher. And this informed result, people have heard, okay, yes, I heard that the rates were higher before. Now I know we have a 36% cap. Do you support or oppose it? 71% support, 17% oppose. That net support of plus 54 points is true across demographics. Again, you see Democrats and Republicans strongly in favor, older and younger women and men, white voters, people of color, all strongly in favor of having a rate cap, particularly when they've heard that the interest rates used to be higher. And you do see this jump, though, in support. It becomes higher as a result of people hearing that piece of information. It was already high. The support for the rate cap, it jumps even higher when they hear that information about previous interest rates. So that was all among voters statewide. Now looking specifically at this population again of the people who actually were receiving high interest loans in the past, who were receiving this type of payday or auto title loan prior to 2021. 71% of them, before they get any additional information, say, yeah, I support a 36% rate cap. Only 23% oppose it. When they hear that the rates were higher in the past of 178% and 297%, their support also jumps from 71 up to 81% in favor, 67% strongly support the 36% rate cap once they hear what the previous. So voters support it, voters across all demographics support the rate cap, and high interest loan recipients themselves even more strongly support that rate cap, more so than other voters. And then finally, we asked a separate policy question: should small business lenders be required to disclose the APR of their loans? So it's not only consumers, but small businesses, of course, that are susceptible to various forms of predatory lending. And should there at least be a disclosure in place so that they know what the actual APR is on the loans that are being offered? 81% support the requirement to have this disclosure. This is a case where we do see a little bit more partisan pattern in the sense that Democrats are overwhelmingly in favor and independents, Republicans are only somewhat overwhelmingly in favor, but they're all overwhelmingly in favor of this APR disclosure. 81% support, 11% opposed, every demographic again saying that they want to require this type of disclosure on APR for small business loans. So that is a clear finding from the research as well. I wanted to make sure we shared that. So that's the information we have from this research. Of course, my colleague Emily very much involved in developing the data. I will turn back to Horacio to take your questions. I'm happy to discuss the findings further.
Thank you so much, David and Emily, for your work on this. Just curious, have similar polls been conducted elsewhere, nationally, or in other states?
They have. It's hit or miss, depending on who, as you noted, someone has to fund the research and decide that it's worth looking into. So it's not everywhere all the time that we have data on this, but we ourselves have obtained data on this in the state of South Dakota, which, as you know, has also legislation on interest rates. In the District of Columbia, we've surveyed and found, and basically every time we do this, and in the state of Nebraska also, we did a survey on this. And those are in the last few years that my team here has worked on. And in every case, I mean, there's a little bit of variation in terms of what the number is and what the cap is and what the specific circumstances in the state are. But the overwhelming finding has always been the same, which is voters, all essentially the very large majorities of voters, everywhere you ask, every time you ask, say, I believe we should have caps on interest rates, and lenders should not be able to charge triple digit interest rates for any type of loan in any circumstance. And in fact, if people want to have caps on rates, and in particular, the cap of 36%, which, as you pointed out, has been instituted for military service members, is a number that is widely supported when offered as a policy. And the only sort of negativity around that is that many people still think that that number is too high and would like to see an even lower cap. But there's essentially no large constituency in any state where we have seen data where there is a large group of people saying, no, I would like there to be, high interest, triple digit interest rate loans available in my state. There is an industry that supports that. They have a lot of lobbyists. They have essentially no public support.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, it's obviously we are in somewhat of a polarized environment on a lot of different issues. But I think if memory serves me correctly, I think when he was a candidate, President Trump was even talking about a 10% cap on credit cards. Not quite sure how credit card companies would stay open with that, but it kind of looks like this is interesting that a rate cap is bipartisan, especially, like I said, in a time where bipartisan agreement is scarce. Why, why do you think that is? I think it might be obvious, but I'm just kind of curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, there hasn't really been an argument made to the voters, to the public, that they believe about why interest rates should be so much higher. The best argument that has been made on the other side, of the most effective to some people, is that, well, there wouldn't be access to credit. I think we've sort of demolished the accuracy of that argument through seeing what the actual experience of high income, high interest loan recipients has been in Illinois. Um, that in fact they do have access to credit when rates are capped, and that they don't need these type of predatory loans in order to get by. But beyond that, there's no voter can find a reason that makes sense to them why any company should be allowed to charge such enormous interest rates on people who can barely afford to get by and are living paycheck to paycheck as it is. And so there's a reason that that's a sort of populist economic position. And in fact, as you noted, politicians of all stripes, including the new president, have talked about that there need to be limits. There need to be lower interest rates and credit available to people without charging such exorbitant interest rates. And that is essentially a unanimous position. There isn't anyone who isn't on the payroll of the payday loan industry that seems to genuinely believe that we should have such high rates. And the only argument that they have made, with some effectiveness in some places, is credit will dry up if this isn't available. But you have seen through policy studies and lots of other research, not just ours, that that's not the case. So they're just the reason it's bipartisan is that there has not been any effective argument or reason offered to the voters that they would understand for why there would need to be rates this high. It just doesn't make any sense to them, and they're perfectly happy to support having a restriction, having a regulation on this rate.
Well, let's stay on that vein of credit will dry up sort of argument. Do you have any, and I'm sorry, I'm asking you to opine on things, but I figured you've had a lot more time looking at responses and thinking about this than most. Do you have any thoughts on why former high cost loan borrowers didn't access other credit sources before the rate cap went into effect? It looks like they found other sources, but in many cases, they may have always been there. Why do you think having that rate cap suddenly made them look for alternatives that were cheaper? Because you would think borrowers would be price sensitive and be looking for those in the first place.
Yeah, if it were easy to understand what rate you're being charged, I think people might be more price sensitive about the interest rate, but it isn't easy to understand, as I think, lots of other policy and behavioral research shows, right? And we do public opinion research on, attitudes toward policies and laws. I'm not going to claim greater expertise than that, but it is very clear from the data that we've obtained here that people have a range of, people have to, they find ways to get by when they're struggling. And that sometimes involves taking loans, borrowing money, finding credit. They will take what is available and easy to access. And if the easiest thing to access that can immediately solve their problem is a very high interest rate loans, obviously many of them did that and have done that in the past and do that when it's available. When that's not available as an option, there are several other options that they've obtained. And we've done some earlier research where people talked about, you know, borrowing money from family, finding other local community loan sources, um, rearranging their budgets. And, it's not easy to be poor in America or to be in a struggling household where you're trying to make ends meet. But it is, uh, having a type of loan that actually makes that problem worse by sucking money out of their accounts every month in with usurious payments doesn't make it any easier. And in fact, the people in Illinois have found that they are no longer suffering some of those negative impacts from those high interest loans. And in most cases, they are able to find other ways to put together the money they need to make ends meet.
Now, is that so, it's like you had talked previously about other states that were able to do this kind of research. Um, were the responses comparable in terms of being able to have alternatives to high cost debt, or do you think that's a
I
little
don't want
less
to
consistent?
overclaim it because we didn't ask that direct question everywhere. So, but I think if you look across, and frankly, the policy research that you all have done, that folks like the Center for Responsible Lending have done nationally and in the states, they have found that at the actual direct experience of people in states who have interest rate caps is that they're still able to access credit, that they have found ways to obtain cash when they need it, and that if anything, that it's had a positive impact generally on their finances not to have this enormous removal of resources from their communities through these very, very high interest rates going into the pockets of a very wealthy financial industry. So we haven't seen anything to contradict that in our opinion research. But I'd be careful that I just don't know for sure in every state. I can't say for sure in every state that we have comparable numbers to these. This is the most detailed study we've done on it in a state in the last few years. And it's a unique, and it was an interesting opportunity because it's a state where this is a fairly recent law, a fairly recent impact, and we're able to ask people about their previous experience as well as their current experience, which was exciting to be able to get that research and see the finding that in fact people had negative impacts before. They're able to access credit now, and they very strongly support having continuing to have a cap on interest rates.
Interesting. Thank you. Looks like just even from the chat and some of the questions, there may be some demand for an additional survey regarding small business lending transparency. I know you asked that question. Is there anything deeper you can provide beyond simply the initial reaction, or was that pretty much the
No,
end
just
game?
we had to pick, and in any survey, there's limited time. We had to pick and choose what we focused on here. The main focus of this research was on this predatory lending and high interest loans and the interest rate cap. But because this other topic was before the legislature, we add this question about the APR disclosure. Very clear and strong finding there. There's no reason to doubt that that's the case. It's extremely strong support across the board on that point. But we didn't go into the details of other versions of that policy or reasons that people might be for or against it.
Yeah, I'm not sure we ever had an opportunity to share this with you, but shortly after the passage of the Predatory Loan Prevention Act, we had gotten a number of messages from a variety of different chambers of commerce who said thank you. And it
Behalf
dig
of their
in a little
small
bit.
business, yeah, their business customers.
Exactly.
Mhm.
A lot of small businesses, especially micro enterprises, they rely on consumer debt to be able to get the $500 they need, the $1,000 they need for equipment that sometimes would take too long through any other method or through a small business loan with a financial institution. And it really raised a reminder for us that the Federal Truth in Lending Act really only applies to a subset of loans and has an exemption for small business loans, and that has been the next phase of our work in terms of transparency and disclosure. We're not talking about a cap, obviously, but we're just talking about giving small businesses the ability to effectively compare prices. And that goes into your answer with regard to why sometimes people did not look for more responsible and affordable credit options before the rate cap because it can be deceptive. And within those rules, I think it was great to have champions within IDFPR, which is what we call our state division of banking here, to make sure that everybody understands truly the cost of capital. And I think that that is something that unfortunately we need to continue to fight for in other areas, not just in consumer. Let me see here. I think there are a couple of other questions coming up. See if some of them overlap. Yeah, it looks like there's an organization in Oregon that is talking about having fintech companies using the access to credit argument, and they're wondering if there's any way that they can counter this argument without also feeding into the argument. Um, any thoughts?
Yeah, it's an important strategic question. Of course, our answer is always going to be, well, go do some research. But which I happen to be sitting in Oregon right now. I'd be happy to do the work there. But I think it's important to distinguish in doing that research. And one thing we were careful to do between the actual experience that people have with the existing high interest predatory loans and their desire and ability to have access to credit on better terms than that, with a cap or some kind of restriction on the level of interest that can be charged to them. They overwhelmingly support having that when option is available. In some cases, they may not know if that option, they may not be aware that there's a possibility that you could have the financial system in your state where there are other ways of obtaining credit, where there are loans available, but they can only charge so much for them up to a certain cap. And that the overwhelming experience of both individual consumers and we would assume small businesses is that they can still obtain credit, but they're no longer being charged such wildly over the top interest rates and are financially healthier as a result. But that, is something you would ideally would be great to demonstrate, in that state to show that people have that experience and have that very strong preference to have, yes, they want credit to be available and they want it to be available at reasonable interest rates, not at overwhelmingly high triple digit interest rates. They are opposed to that and don't think it should exist.
Okay. We have a question from a former colleague of mine. We worked together in California about the wording of the questions from that industry survey. Were you able to get the actual wording to understand whether or not that was
We were,
leading
at least to
anyone?
the extent that they disclosed it, they had reported this question in a public report the year previous in 2023, saying that they, look, we have all three-quarters of the recipients couldn't get credit. And then we looked in, and first, just the actual number they reported wasn't three-quarters, it was a little over 50%. But then we saw that it was a somewhat confusing question because it asked, were you unable? Which is you asking people a negative, to affirm a negative, that can be confusing. But we went ahead and just replicated that question because we also thought that the sample, they did not report clearly on how they obtained their sample. They were just saying these were, customers of the type of loans that they offer. So we assume it was their own customer database in some form, and how they invited people, how they screened, how they made sure it was a representative sample. We don't know. But we thought, well, let's just see if we ask this same question with an accurate, legitimate sample of all the representative sample of people in Illinois who have obtained previously high interest loans. Do they have the same response? And they didn't, right? And we found a majority said no to that question. In other words, I was able to obtain credit. And then when we asked in the affirmative, have you needed to borrow money since 2021? And were you able to do that? A much simpler and more direct way of asking the question. We got that 80% number said, yes, I was able to borrow money when I needed to. So all of that, I think, shows pretty clearly that they're not reporting an accurate result there in terms of how they framed the question or in terms of the sample they took.
In terms of the process of assessing whether or not a borrower is a good risk, there are issues of credit score, income, small business owner, revenue, et cetera. And I'm wondering in the conversations to the respondents that you had, whether or not there was discussion with the borrower about their credit score, their income, or their revenue to see if these factors impacted their ability to access credit or not.
The answer, I don't really know. It would be, I mean, we didn't do that level of depth in a 18-minute survey that we were doing with people online and on the phone. So I don't actually know. It's more a kind of a qualitative piece of research where you could really engage and understand sort of what's the process people are going through and addressing the needs they have to, obtain money to make ends meet, to pay the bills. It's certainly challenging and difficult for people to do that, but it's not helped when they have enormous interest fees being siphoned off of their paychecks every week. That's certainly not making it easier. So we would assume that those experiences are have changed for the better in the sense that they're not having that drain on their resources, but you'd have to do a lot of deeper interviews, I think, to really understand the dynamics of what it's like for folks day to day. You'd certainly be interested in learning more about that, but the overview finding is pretty clear from this research already that they support having a cap. They don't want to go back to the days of higher interest rates, and they don't particularly need to have this type of predatory loan available in order to obtain credit.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's easy to step back and start going down a rabbit hole of all the questions you could have asked and realizing that
There's
really
plenty of things
good.
we'd love to know, right? And to be clear, the financial lives of low income and working class Americans are terribly understudied. Like there's a lot we don't know. We don't know enough about what it's like. Honestly, would be my general take on that. But to the extent we've been able to capture some fundamental beliefs here, it's really quite clear what they believe about this particular type of loan lending and whether it should exist or not in their state.
And one of the challenges, obviously, was that it's also a very personal story. We've had a hard time as a coalition finding people. We didn't have a hard time finding people that feel like they had been preyed upon by this industry. We had a very hard time finding people that were willing to publicly tell their story. It's almost nobody ever comes back from Las Vegas saying, "Wow, I lost this much money." Because it's a
And
little
wow,
bit
the house really
embarrassing, or
screwed
maybe
me.
they don't
Yeah,
want to. Yeah, yeah. So that
right.
was a bit of a challenge. One thing that's interesting is that there are some states that have rate caps lower than Illinois. Were it's like there's that argument about access to credit and 36% maybe being too high, but at some point taking into consideration the performance and the risk and the cost of capital for the lenders, um, did you have you had in any of the work or some of the conversations you've had in other states, were any of those in states where had rate caps lower than in Illinois, and were the answers of finding alternatives the same or different?
I don't, we have not done any experiential type research where we asked about what has actually changed for people financially as a result of a rate cap that is lower than 36. So I don't know the answer to that. Every time we have asked people, should there be a cap, whatever number the number is, they have overwhelmingly said yes.
Yeah.
There should be a cap on interest rates. It should not be just whatever the lender wants to charge, or some triple digit number. It is always 36% or lower would be the preferred uh, restriction, right? People will say, I want there to be lending, I want to have loans available, and I want them to be at a reasonable rate, at least somewhat reasonable rate of 36% or lower. And that's been consistently true everywhere we've asked it. But I can't say with any detail, like, has the experience been different in a state that has a lower cap? We haven't done that type of study.
Yeah, thank you. I promise this interrogation will come to an end soon. The Brent Adams, our SVP of Policy and Advocacy here at Woodstock, often says that the industry tends to migrate towards the less regulated section. And I think right now there is a possibility that some of these borrowers are using buy now, pay later or earned wage access, the regulatory oversight of which is either non-existent or somewhat questionable. Clearly, that wasn't part of what we were asking in terms of the initial poll because we really wanted to focus on this. But it seems like there may be additional questions to be asked in terms of future phases of this work with regard to where some of those borrowers are finding alternatives. We were able to work very closely with financial institutions, community development financial institutions, nonprofits, credit unions, and even some faith-based organizations to make sure that there was a safety net. We clearly understand the fact that people need help overcoming short-term cash needs, but also recognizing that sometimes when you're drowning in debt, more debt is not the right answer. So trying to come up with other alternatives is ideal, and we've done the best that we can to identify those and put those in a resource guide that we have online at We Prosper Illinois or weprosperil.org to the extent possible. But I'm wondering in my last question, I'm wondering if there's something that piqued your interest, that's something that may have surprised you in the questions that you and your team were asking that you weren't expecting, or maybe a question that after all of these conversations you wished you would have asked that we can consider with regard to our ongoing work in this.
It's a great question. I think honestly, I wasn't terribly surprised by the findings here, but we definitely got more detail than we had seen previously on both the ability of previous customers of this predatory loan industry to be able to obtain other types of credit and to be able to make ends meet and get over the hump as needed. And that was, it was interesting to see that they've had a range of ways of doing that, which we hadn't previously looked at in detail. So that was not, if not surprising, kind of interesting and new to be able to see that. Um, and then I think looking forward, the thing that we'd really like to learn more about is what is as you noted, there are continual attempts to uh, you know prey on people's financial instability by finding ways to get them into debt, right? That's essentially what the industry does, and that they will continue to do that. They're probably continuing to do that in Illinois, finding ways to try to get around the cap that exists and carving out exceptions and so forth, as you noted. So I think it would be very interesting to see if the um, the degree to which people understand that that's happening and the degree to which they would support or oppose extending the kind of protections on different types of financial products And if it's a matter of simply clarifying what the actual interest rate is that people wind up paying through these different financial mechanisms, such as buy now, pay later, is just making that point clear enough for people to understand, A, that that's not a financially healthy way to obtain credit, and B, that would they support restricting that or putting, extending caps to that type of product. So that would be very interesting to learn, and something we probably need to learn more about in terms of because there's no question that there's uh, other things happening out there in the industry, and of course what's happening at the federal level with the gutting of the CFPB and the attempt to pull back on regulation of all kinds. Whether people are going to need even more of these protections, it certainly looks like they will in the states, and so there's certainly plenty of opportunities to study what could be done to protect people, both from the existing practices of this industry, but also the new types of products and new types of offers that are being made, and what would help people to see what's actually being done there, and what would they support in terms of restricting it. That would be interesting to find out.
No, it's you actually made a few of the points I was hoping to close with. We're only a
Okay,
couple
good.
away here,
Well,
so
very
that
good.
that was
Definitely.
wonderful, David.
Yeah.
And it's like obviously it is so important that our work is supported to be able to hire an organization like Lake to do valid academic polling and research that helps inform our policy position. I'm going to channel my inner Sports Center host and focus on highlights of what we heard today quickly. 88% of all likely voters support a rate cap of 36% or lower. At 95%, former high interest loan recipients are even more likely than the general population to support a rate cap of 36% or low, and 88% support a rate cap lower than 36%. That's startling. 81% of high cost loan recipients were still able to access credit even with a 36% rate cap. And Woodstock Institute and a number of our partners, we're working on making sure that we understand the small dollar consumer loan process as well as possible to understand where there might be gaps that we need to fill to make sure that more people get what they need, but responsibly and affordably. So with that said, always more work to do. The existing infrastructure for consumer protection seems to be changing by the minute. I'm getting little dings here about, the acting director of the CFPB, the secretary, the Treasury Secretary. I believe the phrase is freezing all CFPB work. So, which means that somebody has to pick up the ball, and it looks like it's going to be up to us at the state level. And I know that we have some folks on here that are either doing it already, are models of how that can be done, or are going to be working with us to make sure that it's done. So a big thanks to David. Big thank you to all of you for attending. I know we're between, for those in the Midwest and the East Coast, we're between you and lunch. And for those of you guys in the West Coast, between us and the fifth cup of coffee. Thank you very much. David, again, we thank you so much for the excellent work you've done.
Pleasure.
You've been
Thank you.
great partners. Thank you, everybody. Make it a great